You're listening to the Sick and Good podcast. My name is Dustin Messick, RDN. I'm a cancer survivor.
My name is Dr. Colin Goodwin, and I'm a cancer survivor. We're discussing topics related to cancer treatment and recovery while promoting wellness.
To find a balance between sick and good.
That during the cancer process, both can be true.
The Sick and Good podcast is for educational purposes only. The podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment, and before undertaking a new healthcare regimen.
Today we have Brad Zebrack joining the podcast. Brad Zebrack is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and a member of the University of Michigan Cancer Center. It's the Division of the Cancer Control and Population Sciences. As a social worker, educator, and social scientist, Brad has been involved in the development and evaluation of peer support programs for adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. His research on quality of life and cancer survivorship for young people affected by cancer has been supported by the National Cancer Institute, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and Hope Lab Incorporated. Brad is also a long-term survivor of Hodgkin's lymphoma, diagnosed in the tender age of 25. But wanted to welcome you to the podcast, Brad.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Dustin. Great to be here.
Can you speak a little bit to that interest in the cancer field and maybe just treating the adolescent and young adult population in particular?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I got interested in this kind of work because I was a young person diagnosed with cancer at the age of 25 and had my own personal experience and challenges with it. And at that age, being 25 years old, I was sort of like getting my career up and running. And I knew I liked working with kids. And then I had this cancer experience. So then I started thinking about, wow, is there a job out there that kind of would mix sort of a focus on healthcare with working with kids? And that's how I learned about the field of pediatric oncology, that there is a relatively small proportion of people, children, teenagers, young adults who are diagnosed with cancer. It's not just something that happens to old people. So yeah, I thought, wow, there's my calling. And I've been now 30 going on 40 years in this area of work now.
Can you tell us about your current positions?
So I'm now a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. And, at this point in my life, I've evolved from being a cancer survivor to a social worker who worked with young cancer patients and their families, to then getting my PhD and moving into education and research. And now, as a professor, I just have an opportunity to work on a lot of different and interesting projects. In some cases, it's research. In some cases, it's helping organizations develop programs to support young people with cancer. So those are just a couple of things that I get to do at this point.
Can you tell me a little bit about your specific role at the University of Michigan?
So I teach in the School of Social Work. So it's a graduate program. So I work and I teach the courses that are related to students who want to work in the healthcare field in some way. So it's really an opportunity to share, what I've done in the field and kind of role model for them what are possible job opportunities. A lot of the students come in similarly where they've had life experiences that they want to now use. Some of them are interested in working with people who have alcohol, drug, substance use difficulties. Some of them want to work in areas of suicide prevention. Some of them want to work in the areas of mental health. And even though the focus of my work has been in cancer, all these areas really overlap. So, I have an opportunity to teach. And as a teacher, I learn as much in preparing for classes and working with students. So a lot of what I've learned in my teaching, I've been able to apply in my research and develop some interesting research projects that I have going on right now. Yeah, those are just, the main things that I do.
And I imagine you have so much to share, and seeing how much experience you've had with research, I had the thought, I'm like, Brad must have insomnia. He must have a sleep disorder. Like, there's no way that this guy actually sleeps with the amount of work that he gets done.
Oh, I do, man. Life balance is important. I do leave my office late afternoons and get home in the evenings, kind of shut things down. Weekends, I really try to minimize work-related things. I have been at this for quite a long time now, so I have accumulated quite a body of work, but it's been over a long, long period of time.
Well, I'm very interested to hear about your involvement in establishing some peer support groups for adolescents and young adult cancer survivors.
Yeah, it goes back to my own personal experience and recognizing that, in the year, this was 1985, 1986, when I was going through treatment, I was pretty isolated. Cancer support groups were kind of actually a new thing. And living in Southern California at the time, in the mid 1980s, was when the cancer support community originally was founded. And it was founded as something called the Wellness Community by Dr. Harold Benjamin. And, I'd heard about it from some other, mostly from friends of my parents who had cancer, because again, there's not a whole lot of young people that you run into who've had cancer. But I thought it was kind of interesting, this idea of a support group. So I went a few times to this house that they had down in Santa Monica. And it was very welcoming. It was very friendly. But as I looked around the room, 25, 30 people in the room, all my grandparents' age. So again, I realized, wow, there's not a whole lot out there to support young people with cancer. So fast forward a couple of years after I had gotten my master's degree in social work, and I had my first job as a social worker at Children's Hospital in Oakland, California, I realized, wow, here's an opportunity to develop a support program for the adolescents, for the teenagers who I was meeting and seeing their isolation and experience. So I built up a peer support program. We located a few other young people, young adult survivors who had been treated at Children's Hospital, but then it kind of moved on. And we built up a peer support program for teenagers with cancer. This was before Immerman's Angels, before Stupid Cancer, before any of the great work that a lot of these organizations now, Young Survival Coalition, a lot of these organizations now have these built-in peer support programs. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, this was all pretty new.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about. Before all of these organizations, that there wasn't like a whole lot of support or resources at the time that you were going through a lot of your experience, your journey with cancer.
Yeah, exactly, Dustin. There was plenty of information out there, but it was all geared towards older people.
Yeah,
because mostly it's older people who get cancer. But I think what's happened since like the mid 2000s. And Colin and Dustin, you guys are like two examples. It's young people who've said, hey, there's opportunity to create more services and support for young people with cancer because there's just not enough out there. And I would say that, what I see now is a lot of the program and services that are being made available to young people with cancer have been created by young people with cancer. And that's just sort of, to me, this amazing model of from ground up development of peer support programs, young people reaching out to help other young people. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, that is really awesome. I realized back when I went through my journey, I really feel like there wasn't a whole lot of resources for adolescents, but maybe there was more than I was aware of. This is the mid 2000s. I feel like even more so now, there probably is even more than there was before.
Yeah, definitely now. Mid 2000s, I think, there was the issues like cancer survivorship were on the radar. I think there's been a lot of work to help young people who are survivors of cancer when they were children. And I think that was a good starting point that, a lot of the support programs that have been built since the 90s and the early 2000s were sort of an evolution of support programs that were created for young people like teenagers who had cancer, leukemia when they were 5 years old. And I think that a lot of those programs could help young people who are diagnosed in their teens and 20s. But also, there's something very different about having your life disrupted at age 18, age 21, 25, even 30, than being 5 years old when you're still kind of, living under your parents' roof and they're pretty much taking care of everything. But when you're a teenager or a young adult and you're trying to become independent and make your own life choices and then being diagnosed with cancer, that's a whole different experience. And I think it requires a different set of support resources and skills. And I think that's really what we've seen now over the last 15 years.
Brad, can you tell us about your international experience in this role of establishing some peer support groups?
Yeah. So, as I was, developing this program at Children's Hospital back in the early 1990s for teenagers with cancer, I couldn't find anything that was happening in the United States that was anything like what I wanted to be able to be doing. But then with a little bit of research and there was the emergence of a World Wide Web, right? So I heard about this organization in Australia called Canteen. And it turned out that here was an organization that had been in existence for already 10 or 15 years in Australia that was doing the kind of stuff that I wanted to do, to provide support for young people affected by cancer. So being able to turn to a model somewhere else in the world and say, okay, let me see if I can recreate what they did there here in the United States was certainly very empowering. And it gave me the confidence to think that I could even be successful in doing this.
That's actually really exciting and a great way to think outside the box. Reminds me of musicians can't make it in America. They go to international. They look outside.
Yeah, you keep the dream alive, whatever it takes.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about your current federally funded research with the National Institute of Health and any other research that you might be doing that's like non-federal.
Sure. So the work that I'm doing now has really evolved over the last 25 years or so. In the early phases of my career, I was interested in looking particularly at mental health outcomes and quality of life for young people affected by cancer. And I would say, the first 20 years of my research has looked at how does cancer impact people's lives and in all the different ways that it impacts their lives and disrupts their lives. And I think to where where I'm at now is there's really been now in the 2020s, an emergence of an understanding that we're also a product of our environments, that it's not only cancer that disrupts our lives. It's there are other aspects of our life that were going on before we're diagnosed with cancer that could be disruptive, but they could also serve as resources and supports to build on to be able to cope with cancer. And I realized that, wow, the research has sort of all started from the point of, okay, you've been diagnosed with cancer. How does that now affect your life? But we've ignored all the stuff that happened to young people before they had cancer, but they still bring that with them into their treatment, into their lives. So we're now looking at a study to do a much deeper dive into understanding what young people's lives were like before they had cancer. And also, what are the current conditions in which they're living? What's their family context? How socially connected do they feel, or how isolated might they be? Because we now know that things like social isolation are bad for our health. What exposures to trauma or to discrimination, to poverty, what role might that play in how people are recovering after they've had cancer? So we're doing a much broader look at the context of people's lives as they move into life after being successfully treated for cancer. And then the other piece of it that we're looking at is because, again, the last 20 years, we've seen this great progress has been done in terms of genomics and genetic sciences. And, we're also looking to see if there's some kind of a genetic profile or biomarker that we can identify as a way to predict which of these young cancer survivors might be at risk for health problems later on in life. Because if we can identify those sooner by a gene profile, then we can get treatment to those folks earlier and hopefully lead to them living a healthier life after cancer.
Well, it's really interesting to hear about thinking about before cancer, because once you get cancer, everything's about the cancer. And to think what are some other factors? And I also really like the piece you shared about social isolation, because it's very common in our society. A lot of people, myself included, you start developing coping skills that are more media focused, movie focused, where you're spending a lot of time indoors and losing your connections. So I'm very interested to see how your research flourishes on this topic.
Yeah, I think that's really key. We've just been through this 2 years plus of COVID and forced isolation, and really has changed people's routines and patterns in life. And I don't think we're quite clear of COVID yet and the after effects. And we certainly are seeing increases in mental health challenges for young people. And I think, Dustin, you're right. It is connected to that isolation that people have experienced, dealing with these years of COVID and afterwards. I'll give you one other example. I was thinking about that, something that really sort of shook me years back to realize that it's not always about the cancer for people as they're trying to move forward in their life. I remember interviewing this one young man as part of a research project that I was doing, where I was going out to people's young survivors' homes and interviewing them and asking them to tell me about the impact of cancer on their life. And I remember this one young man, he had been diagnosed and treated for testicular cancer. He had both of his testicles removed as part of his treatment. So I knew a little bit about him before going into the interview, and I was just assuming that his cancer, probably one of the most impactful things that had happened to him in his life. He was, I think, at the time, 19 or 20 years old. And as we were talking, he was telling me a story about when he was 13 years old, living with a single mom and an infant baby sister. And his mom was struggling with alcohol and drug problems. So there would be days on end. So and at 13 is also when he was diagnosed and treated for Hodgkin lymphoma. So I was kind of asking him about Hodgkin's and how he was dealing with that. And then his story kept going back to he had so little time to focus on himself because he had to take care of his baby sister. He had to feed her. He had to change her. He had to put her down to sleep. He had to care for this baby as a 13-year-old. And it made me really realize that, wow, life doesn't stop when you're diagnosed with cancer. It certainly diverts, but you're still carrying on whatever life you were living prior to that diagnosis. And I really think now we have to really do a much better job in terms of understanding. If we want to understand the impact of cancer on people's lives, we have to understand the impact of their lives on their cancer.
Yeah, I think it's more like a systemic look at it, and really zooming out and looking at those influences and certainly the roles that they have in their lives, whether it's social roles or these other things that are going on in their lives that are concurrent. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about your experience with complementary and alternative medicine, and perhaps your participation in the integrated oncology scholarships at the University of Michigan.
Yeah. Well, like so many of the things that I'm doing now at sort of academic research, teaching, training levels are because I've had some kind of personal exposure or experience with it. When I was going through my treatment in the mid-late 1980s, so this was before even the invent of Zofran as an anti-nausea medication. So dealing with the nausea from my chemotherapy, dealing with some of the other side effects of treatment, I didn't feel like I was in a position to say no to many suggestions or ideas that people were telling me about in terms of helping me deal with feeling so sick. I had a cousin who suggested I go see a chiropractor. And my father's a primary care physician. So, he had somewhat of a bias against chiropractic medicine, but I was open to anything that was going to assist me. And seeing the chiropractor led me to seeing a hands-on healer. And now I was a college graduate at the time. I understand enough about science to kind of wonder and question about where's the data, where's the evidence that really says things like hands-on healing is going to improve life for people. But I went for it and I actually found that going to a hands-on healer the morning before I would go for my chemotherapy helped with the anxiety. When I would come back from my chemotherapy treatments, I would lay in bed for several hours, sometimes for a day or two, until I felt just well enough to get out of bed, go down to the refrigerator and make myself something to eat. But then after I got involved in the hands-on healing, I realized that my recovery after chemotherapy was much quicker. And part of it was just I found a tool. I found something for me that helped me deal with the anxiety both before chemotherapy and afterwards. So, as a single patient, I'm what we call in science an N of one. I'm my own anecdotal evidence, but it worked for me. And that's all the evidence that I needed. I had, the same cousin. She also wanted me to go with her to see her guru. Again, who am I to say no? And I went with her, and that was a little bit too much going to see a guru. And I didn't go do that again. But I realized that, and then through my continuing education over the years afterwards, I realized that people practice a lot of these traditional, culturally based practices that maybe don't necessarily have a scientific basis for them, but there is a growing scientific basis for things that 30 years ago we would have poo-pooed. Mindfulness meditation, the role that yoga may play, hypnosis. We have now a growing body of evidence that these are practices that can be and have been demonstrated useful for some people in dealing with the anxiety, dealing with the symptoms associated with cancer and its treatment. When I had the opportunity here at the University of Michigan to be part of an NCI-funded training program that Colin, you had the opportunity to be a part of, I was all on board because again, as an individual of one, I know it helped me. I knew that there was an evidence base, which meant many of these practices have the potential to help other cancer patients. And if training healthcare professionals was a way to expose more cancer patients to some of these practices, I was in. I felt it was a good idea.
I was going to make a joke that maybe chiropractic treatment is that gateway to hands-on healing. It's what's often referred to as that gateway service.
Right. Because the medical doctors are very cautious, as I think they should be in prescribing interventions that don't have a strong scientific evidence, because that's what we go to doctors for, right? We go to doctors to get the best medical practice. But I think what we're recognizing now in the 21st century is that health is not just about medical practice. If we're trying to achieve better health outcomes, health is not just physical, but it's psychological. It's
a whole body.
It's spiritual. It's a whole body. And, we can't just rely on doctors to have that whole body of evidence. I think that's just too much to expect from them. They're expert in what they do. But now we know that there are other providers out there who are expert in what they do as well, that can serve as complementary and supplements to what doctors are doing. That said, I think the one other thing I would throw out there that I think is really important is that there are also a lot of folks out there practicing snake oil, trying to sell people things that are not going to be helpful to them. So I think it's really incumbent upon those of us who are trying to make a better path for people with cancer is to also enable them to give them some of the skills necessary to make to make judicial decisions, to make informed decisions, to be able to know how to discriminate and make good judgments so that they can select out the offerings that are going to be, more likely to help them and to avoid those snake oil salesmen that are out there that are trying to just pass off some goods that are really not going to help them.
Yeah, I was thinking of almost like filtering out the static so you can actually get a signal, something that's actually going to be connecting and it's something that works for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Earlier, Colin, when I was telling you about the Adolescent Young Adult Global Congress that'll be happening later this summer, this is the 5th Global Congress. For a couple of years, they were delayed due to COVID. But for the 5th time, people from around the world will be coming together, healthcare providers who work with adolescents and young adults, researchers, and even young adults themselves who have developed programs and services, either through brick and mortar communities or online communities. This Congress is for all these folks. And there's workshops, there's plenaries, there's happy hours, there's, tons of opportunities for people to come together and share and connect. So it'd be great, if you guys can make it to that and spread the word later on in June of this year.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I also wanted to ask, so you did a program evaluation of NPO First Ascent. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So again, an example of here's an organization now, I think, they must be at least 15, 20 years now, founded by a young man who was affected by his mother's cancer and wanted to turn around and do something to help other people. So developed this program that over the years now has been providing opportunities for young people affected by cancer to go out into the outdoors and spend 7 days kayaking, surfing, rock climbing, challenging their bodies in ways that cancer really compromised, both physically as well as psychologically. And over the years, First Ascent has really been so successful in providing great opportunities for young people all across the country. And what they wanted to do was to somehow demonstrate in scientific terms the impact, the positive impact that they were having, that they were seeing have on participants in their program. To talk about the magic and the special sauce of what happens around a campfire after you've been on a river for 3 days is amazing, but it's not scientific. And I was able to help them with some ways to collect data and answer some particular questions and concerns they had in terms of how was their program having an effect on their participants. And I think one thing that was kind of interesting about this was that they were noticing that, for any given program that they were running, 80% of participants would be women and just 20% of participants would be men. So they were wondering how they might be able to increase participation amongst men in their programs. They were also noticing that when people would cancel, and obviously people have, all sorts of valid reasons for canceling a trip at the last moment, the proportion of people who were canceling was so disproportionately men. And they were curious as to why that was happening. And they were asking, as part of my research, could we try to figure out what is it about men that's, preventing them from signing up and participating and then dropping out at the last minute. And, we were able to kind of do some in-depth interviews with both men who were participating in the programs as well as those who had dropped out, so we could kind of get an idea of what was going on. And it was really notable that, men much of their experience with cancer was this threat to their physical viability. And they had concerns about like going on some kind of a program or trip that would require them to be physical. And they expressed this fear of not being able to live up to the physical challenges of some of these programs. Whereas women didn't have any of those concerns. They had sort of no concern or worry about a threat to masculinity in the way that men were experiencing. So they never saw that kind of emotional threat as a reason not to go on these groups. So one of the recommendations we made to First Descents was to sort of get more men to provide testimonials as to the benefits that they got the program, but also to talk specifically and explicitly about having some of these concerns and worries about the physicality of the programs and how they overcame some of those.
Yeah, that makes actually a lot of sense. I mean, before cancer, as a man myself, you were able to do essentially anything. And then after you have this
we believe we can.
Right?
Yeah. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, now there's a limit. And it's definitely, especially if you're like really out of breath. Like, I mean, just from looking at the website, and I had heard a little bit about it before the program. And I just thought like, I don't know if I could do half of those things. And they're like, well, you could just go and like hang out and not participate. And I was like, yeah, that seems a little weird. You know, I feel like as a man, you're just like, so what's that guy doing? Oh, he's not participating. He's just going to watch. I was just, so I think I could relate a little bit to like, opting out.
Sure.
I mean, unless they had like they had two levels. You want to go to the level 1 adventure or the level 2?
And that's kind of what does happen on a lot of these programs. That I think what the participants realize is that like they have these worries or fears, just like you're expressing. But once they show up and participate, they realize that, even if you conceive of it as sort of like level 1, level 2, or even level 3, really intense participation, when you get out there into the woods or out there on the water, it's not like that at all. Everybody is engaged equally. And it doesn't matter if you've got, the two people who want to be the gung-ho kayakers who are in the front of the group every single time. And then you have the couple of stragglers who stay back, or maybe even just hop into the trailing boat and go along for the ride instead of kayaking themselves. That once you're on the river and with that group of folks on the river, it doesn't matter. Everybody is equalized in that same moment because everybody on that river has had cancer and everybody understands one another and the challenges that they've been through. So the reality of what happens is so different from what people might imagine before they go out on those trips. So just getting folks over that hump. And it takes courage, and it definitely takes courage to go out and challenge. But I think the payback, people come back from these trips, whether it's First Descents or True North Treks or any other organizations that are providing these types of opportunities for cancer survivors. Afterwards, what you always hear from participants is that it changed my life. It changed my life.
Coming at it from an angle of, and certainly my own personal lens of working in like pain clinics, it made me think like, well, is there a aspect of like a fear of re-injury or just having any threat to like a physical condition or a kinesiophobia or like a fear of like that movement or being jostled? And what I'm hearing is that like maybe it's just like that ability to have that mastery or like have that self-efficacy of being able to have something conquered, have that ability to test yourself.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I remember probably for about 2 years after the finish of my therapy, so my late 20s, sort of like I felt like I was in this gray zone of not knowing how much to push myself physically and how much to hold back for fear of like making myself sick again. And I just kind of had to get there on my own. So, everybody gets to where they're going at their own pace. So whether you're offering a support group or you're offering these trips for cancer survivors, I think from the survivor's perspective, it's like just knowing that it's out there, and when I'm ready to engage in it, I think that's the most important thing.
I really like how you referred to like early survivorship as the gray zone. And in my mind, I went over to like the voiceover for like the Twilight Zone. You've entered the gray zone. Well, Brad, I'm really curious if there's any other particular findings that you would like to share as far as like your research that you've published. If there's any other, whether it's with this research that you did, the program evaluation with First Descent, or like I had alluded to earlier, you've got a impressive amount of research.
Yeah, I guess the last part I'd really like to share with you guys is for teenagers and young adults, just in general, not even before you even throw cancer over it, is the time of life where young people are starting to explore their independence, and they're starting to sort of try to figure out who they are and who they want to be moving forward in their life. They're experimenting, they're testing things out because they're recognizing that they are now becoming more responsible for the decisions that they're making in their own lives, and to recognize things like, when I mess up and I have to be responsible for the consequences of my mess up, hey, life still goes on. And that can actually be sort of an empowering thing. If I messed up and I can still get through it okay, maybe the next time something like that happens, I'll be a little bit more prepared for it. That's sort of how we grow. That's how we evolve from being people in our teens and 20s to our 30s, 40s, 50s, and throughout the remainder of life. And one of the key areas of development for young people, I think, is around their sexual orientation and gender identity. And we're in the 21st century, I think we've been really fortunate that young people are feeling more comfortable sharing amongst themselves and being freer about sexual orientation and gender identity. In the meantime, there's still a lot of oppression. There's still a lot of risks for exposures to threat and violence. So I'm not saying we're in La La Land, the land of Oz, when it comes to explorations of sexual orientation and gender identity. But I think that this is an area of really ripe focus for young people when diagnosed with cancer, because exploration around sexual orientation, engaging in sex, maybe for the very first time, intimacy, becoming more comfortable with who one is in terms of their gender identification. I think young people when they're diagnosed with cancer really need that support. And as healthcare providers, as researchers, we need to really create programs and services and studies that allow young people to see themselves, even as they're trying to figure out who they are, to know that they're going to be treated in a clinical care program, or they're going to be treated in a particular research study in a way that acknowledges who they are at this given time in their lives. So just to give you a concrete example, of what we're trying to do in our research study, many times in surveys, you get to that question about, are you man or woman? And those are just the two boxes that are offered up. We have a much more sophisticated understanding of biological sex and how it's distinguished from gender identification. And if we're going to advance our science, we need to create surveys and research studies that encompass and allow for a much broader understanding of how people identify themselves in terms of their gender, in terms of their sexual orientation. So, for example, in our study now, we have multiple response categories, as well as an open-ended where people could we ask them to please describe their sexual orientation, to describe their gender identification, so that we're not imposing on them minimal categories. We want them to be able to express themselves as broadly and completely as they want and need.
Yeah, I was going to say this, so they're not limited to a checkbox. Mm-hmm. So be able to have an affirmation of their sexual orientation or gender identity there.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I also think it's probably based on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. It's also going to change different experiences through the cancer journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One complication I was just thinking of is just like if there's any need for hormone replacement treatment, that being a complication on that particular experience. Or I think we've used the word journey quite a bit today.
Exactly. And exactly. And I think it's incumbent on the health professionals to, if there's no research that informs what the risks might be, then we need to do that research.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe instead of calling it a journey, we could say ongoing trip.
For sure. I mean, it's the notion of a cancer survivor as initiating at a time of diagnosis and continuing for the rest of one's life, I think is really useful, is really meaningful. Here I'm coming up, I'm coming up on 40 years post-diagnosis. And it's my experience as a young adult with cancer that gets me out of bed in the morning and gets me to work, because the kind of work that I do, the career that I have built, is all grounded in that experience of 40 years ago. So for me, my cancer experience is very much alive, and I use it in the work that I do.
Yeah, and all your work sounds extremely rewarding. And I feel like this podcast got me out of bed this morning. So
yeah,
that makes two
Sunday
of us.
morning, which is hard. It's Sunday morning.
Yeah, but I also was curious if there's any presentations or symposiums that stand out to you right now.
So I think the other thing is a lot of the organizations now that have been founded by young people for young people do a lot of innovative types of programs that appeal to young people. I think Stupid Cancer, for example, the Young Survival Coalition does a lot of excellent program work and support for young women diagnosed and treated for breast cancer. The Leukemia Lymphoma Society does some great work in developing educational programs and content for adolescents and young adults. I think there's a growing network, and a lot of it is online. There's Facebook groups. There's a Twitter hashtag. I believe it's AYACSM, which is hashtag Adolescent Young Adult Cancer Support Movement. Is another way for folks to get connected to one another. I think they do like a live stream once every couple of weeks, and on Twitter. So there's just like a lot of great emerging, innovative support out there that's both in person as well as online and through social media. That I just don't think we can have too much support out there, because the young people, it's challenging for them to find what might be out there for them that's going to be helpful.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Well, Brad, we really wanted to thank you for taking time to have the conversation with us here about quite a few different things you've had the opportunity to be a part of. I really wanted to just, thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise in these fields.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you to you guys for what you're doing, because anything to kind of get the word out there to help young people affected by cancer, help their families, I think that's awesome. So kudos to you guys.
Our podcast will discuss topics related to cancer treatment and the recovery process, including diagnosis, family support, resources, medications, and nutrition. We aspire to have conversations pertinent and relevant to the cancer journey. Thank Thank you for listening to the Sick and Good podcast. We'd like to invite you to connect with us on our social media at Instagram and Facebook accounts. We're also happy to share that we have launched the Sick and Good podcast website, sickandgood.com. This website is a place to read our bios, subscribe to the podcast, listen to full episodes, or read full transcripts, and contact us with your questions or comments. We care about your listener experience and would love to hear from you to keep the conversation going on the topics of cancer and wellness.